If you are joining us after the fact, we are so glad that you did. We're here today with Matthew Soerens, and he serves in a lot of different things right now, U.S. Director of Church Mobilization for World Relief. He has a bio that's varied and things like that, and we're talking about refugees and immigration and some things like that today. He's going to cover a lot of ground, but one of the rules for what we're doing for engagement, there's going to be some Q&A after the fact, so stay all the way through and check that out. If you're with us, use the question and answer button at the bottom of the toolbar and post as they come up, and we'll be able to integrate that into some of the conversations we're having right now and definitely at the end of our time. But these are the times that we find are so rich to have conversations with each other and really to expand our thinking. And when it comes to the refugee crisis, when it comes to immigration, when it comes to the question scripturally, who is our neighbor, there's so many ways that we can approach this and so many differing opinions, and some who want to simplify and some who understand the complexity. But it's, no matter what, it's worth talking about, and not just to get an answer, but to really begin to shape our thinking in the sense of our core values of how we need to approach this in view of God's love and compassion in the creation and the people that he has, and that we shepherd and that we need to reach with the love of God. So Matthew, thank you for your time. Thanks for being with us. And I'm just going to turn it over to you to take the next bit however you would like. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Glenn. It is a pleasure to be with you all, at least virtually. I would usually rather be in Southern California than in Aurora, Illinois, where I live. So I wish I could be with you in person, but we'll thank God for this technology, which is pretty amazing as well. As Glenn said, my name is Matthew. I work with a Christian organization called World Relief. We're actually the humanitarian arm of the National Association of Evangelicals, which the Free Methodist Church is a part of, along with many other evangelical denominations. And for us at World Relief, this issue of refugees and migration is it's very essential to our DNA as an organization. We were started in the mid-1940s to respond to one of the last great refugee crises after World War II in Europe, and when a church in Boston decided, well, we need to do something to help the churches in Europe rebuild. And they reached out to the National Association of Evangelicals and connected churches all across the country to create what was then the War Relief Commission. And a few years went by and they realized that there were challenges beyond just the war in Europe to address. So we became World Relief. And then fast forward a couple decades. So even just at our beginning, really at our center of our organization's focus is the church and the displaced, refugees, immigrants. And then since the late 1970s, we've been involved, including there in Southern California, in resettling refugees into the United States. We're one of 9 agencies that works with the U.S. State Department, and the only one of those 9 that is distinctly an evangelical Christian organization. So we don't get to choose who comes as a refugee, but when our government makes that decision, we are one of the 9 agencies they'll call and say, hey, we've got a family arriving at O'Hare Airport. Can you be there to pick them up? And our mission as an organization isn't just to resettle refugees well, it's to empower the church to serve the most vulnerable. So our goal is not just to be there with our staff, but ideally with a team from a local church that wants to come alongside that family and walk with them through the process of adjustment. And when we look at the vulnerable, we certainly include those coming in through the refugee resettlement program. They're often very vulnerable at first, but also other immigrants who come in a variety of other capacities and have some unique needs as well. But as most of you are pretty well aware, and I'm going to share my screen here so I can share some slides. There we go. As most of you are well aware, this issue of refugees and immigration is an issue that's become rather controversial in our society in the United States. And that has maybe always been true to some extent. Certainly at different points in history, we can see this. But especially in the last few years, it's become this politically charged issue. And again, for World Relief, we don't come at this from a Republican perspective or a Democratic perspective. We come at this from a church perspective. How do we think about this issue as a biblical issue, as a missional opportunity for the church in the United States? But we're also aware that that's not necessarily the perspective of everyone in the congregations that we serve, who are often getting information about the issues of immigration from cable news or from social media or from talk radio, from all different perspectives. And so a few years ago, we actually wanted to understand better because our mission is to empower the church, how are churches thinking about this topic, and how are people in churches thinking about this topic? So we contracted with a polling firm called Lifeway Research, which is kind of a Christian research group, and we asked them to poll self-described evangelical Christians throughout the United States on a number of questions related to refugees and immigration. And I'm not going to go through all the results of that survey, but the one thing that was probably the most troubling statistic we uncovered was we asked, what is the most important factor influencing your views on the arrival of immigrants to your community? And only 12% of evangelical Christians said the Bible. Now, that might have been the number I would have expected for a national sample of all Americans, but this was self-described evangelical Christians who, by definition, would say that the Bible is our authority for pretty much everything, and yet not apparently when it comes to the arrival of immigrants. In fact, the Bible, the views of national Christian leaders, and the teaching of my local church, those three categories combined were mentioned less often than media. So this is often an issue that we haven't thought about from a distinctly biblical perspective. And so what I want to do with our time this afternoon is look at some of the realities regarding refugees and immigration, especially in the US context. And obviously in Southern California, you're in some ways at the epicenter of immigration to the United States. But I want to start by grounding that conversation in what does the Bible say that I believe ought to be informing how we respond to those dynamics of immigration. So I'll start with this reality, which is if we're followers of Jesus, we are followers of a refugee, or maybe an asylum seeker, and I'll cover what the distinction is technically there in a moment. A few years ago, my daughter Zipporah, she was probably 3 years old at the time, she just got really excited about our nativity scene. You can see the picture I took of it there. We got this as a wedding present, but it's fairly stable, sturdy wood, so we kind of let her play with it. And for the whole month of December, she would this was like her favorite toy. She would like to act out the Christmas story. An angel comes to Mary, and then Mary and Joseph go to Bethlehem, and there's a donkey and some other animals and a stable and shepherds and angels and wise men. But she turned to me one day and Zippy said, "Dad, our nativity scene is missing someone. We don't have the mean king." And I thought about that. I don't know if any of you have a nativity set with a King Herod figurine, but I've never seen that. And it made me think that's probably not our favorite part of the Christmas story, right? I mean, we'd maybe rather that the Christmas story end with the wise men, the magi, bowing down before Jesus with their gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And that's a really nice spot to bring down the curtain on the nativity scene, and we can all go home and enjoy a nice meal and open some presents, because even Jesus got presents. But of course, that's not where the Gospel of Matthew ends that story, because in Matthew chapter 2, as soon as the magi, the wise men, go off to their country, Joseph is warned in a dream that Herod, this paranoid, tyrannical Middle Eastern king, who Zippy, my daughter, knew very well from her storybook Bible, was on his way to kill all the little boys in Bethlehem. And we don't know very much from the Gospel of Matthew about the trip, but we know that Joseph was warned to get up in the middle of the night and take Jesus and Mary and escape to Egypt, outside of Herod's dominion, where they would be safe. And in that sense, they indeed are refugees. Now, of course, they didn't have an international legal definition of a refugee at that time, but we do now. Under both US law and international law, a refugee is someone who has fled their country because of a well-founded fear of persecution that is specifically on account of their race, their religion, their political opinion, their national origin, or their social group. And just by that rather limited definition, you can think of lots of people who wouldn't qualify under that definition, who are migrating for other sympathetic reasons. But just under that definition, the best estimates are that there are currently about 26 million people who meet that definition globally, which is the highest number since anyone has been tracking numbers on this. And again, that doesn't include those who are internally displaced, who have fled persecution, perhaps for one of those reasons, but are still within the boundaries of their country, which is another 40 to 45 million or so. And then the other terminology that you've probably heard even in the last few days in the news is that of an asylum seeker. So I think the easiest way to understand an asylum seeker legally is it's someone who professes to be a refugee. That is, they say they have left their country because of a credible fear of persecution because of one of these reasons. But you can only request asylum once you get to the country of destination. So once you're in the United States or at the border, you can request asylum. And until such time as our government has determined that indeed your fear is credible and it is based on one of these reasons and you meet various other qualifications, an asylum seeker, not a refugee. And so, of course, does Jesus fit into either of those definitions? I guess we don't really know from the text how the Holy Family was treated by the Egyptian government, such as it was. We can only speculate on that. We don't know how they were treated by the people of Egypt, where they lived for a while. It's very possible that there were some people who had compassion on them and helped them. It's also quite possible that there was people who were suspicious of them, who maybe said, you know what, how do we know that you're fleeing from Herod and not spies sent by him? Or maybe Joseph heard something like, you know what, Joseph, we've got enough carpenters in this economy without you stealing a job. That's speculation. We don't have that in the text. But what isn't speculation is that for those roughly 26 million people in our world today who are refugees, and frankly for tens of millions others who are displaced for other reasons, they have someone in Jesus who can very personally identify with that experience, with that plight of being woken up in the middle of the night and having to flee, because Jesus himself lived that as in his humanity. Another core biblical principle that I think ought to be foundational for us is this belief that all people, including all immigrants, are made in the image of God. We find that in the very beginning of the Bible in Genesis chapter 1. And Christians have historically understood this to mean that human beings have inherent dignity, that human life is worth protecting simply because we are human beings made in God's image, that we have this inherent dignity. And that in itself gives us a motivation as Christians to want to do all that we reasonably could to protect people who are fleeing the threat of violence or persecution or danger. But there's another dynamic to being made in the image of God that I think is relevant here and that we might overlook, particularly in conversations about immigration. Because very often when we talk about immigration, the conversation nationally and even locally in some cases very quickly goes to, well, what are those people going to take? How much is this going to cost? How many jobs are they going to take? And there's these economic questions. Very quickly, we begin the cost analysis. But of course, a good economist doesn't do a cost analysis. They do a cost-benefit analysis. And if we forget that these are people made in the image of a creator God with the potential to create and to contribute, we forget that they have the potential to contribute as well. And the interesting thing is when the economists do that cost-benefit analysis, they acknowledge that there are some costs associated with immigration, but they also find that there are a lot of contributions, just at a dollars and cents level, to say nothing of the more intangible sort of cultural contributions that immigrants make, or the spiritual contributions that immigrants make to our churches. But just looking on the financial, economic, fiscal level, most economists actually believe that the net economic impact of immigration for the United States is significantly positive. And there's a few reasons for that. We can ask, well, how many jobs are those immigrants going to take? That's a fair question, but only a fair question if we're concurrently asking how many jobs are those immigrants going to create. It turns out that 44% of Fortune 500 companies in this country were founded by an immigrant or their child. So all sorts of huge American companies, several of them, frankly, located there in California, wouldn't be American companies if it wasn't for our country's history of immigration. Might not be companies at all, because many of those companies were founded by people who just might not have had that same opportunity had they been required to stay in their country of origin. Of course, those are big companies, but you find similar dynamics when you look at small businesses, which immigrants are often starting at higher rates than native-born U.S. citizens. Or you can look at the fiscal dynamics. Well, okay, but what about all the costs associated for the government? And there are costs. And depending upon the category of immigrant, the costs are going to vary because different categories of immigrants legally qualify for different sorts of benefits. But refugees are a good example. Refugees, again, under US law, are a subcategory of immigrants who were invited to the United States because they experienced persecution in their country of origin. So they were invited to the United States. They actually get some assistance from the US government that most other immigrants do not qualify for. And so they get some help from a resettlement agency like World Relief. They qualify for some public benefits that other immigrants do not qualify for. And if you look at the average refugee, let's say 6 months after they first arrived, it was rare that they would be contributing more in taxes than they had received from the US taxpayer. But if you look at them 20 years after arrival, it turns out most of them are contributing significantly more than they have received. And that makes sense, right? We would never look at a 6-month-old baby. I have a 6-month-old baby and say, wow, what a drain on the economy. We should just get rid of them. They're not contributing anything in taxes. Of course, we look at people over a horizon of time, and we invest in things like education, knowing that ultimately that is a good investment. Well, the same is true with refugees. There are costs up front, but 20 years after arrival, the average refugee adult has contributed roughly $21,000 more in taxes at all levels, federal, state, and local, than the combined cost of governmental expenditures on their behalf, including that initial resettlement assistance and any public benefits that they've qualified for. Or others would say, okay, refugees, they come lawfully to the United States at the invitation of the government, but what about an immigrant who is not lawfully present, who basically came across the border unlawfully or overstayed a temporary visa? And I think there's often the presumption, well, those people are not paying taxes and they're not contributing in the same ways. But economists do not find that to be true. In fact, the Wall Street Journal surveyed economists a few years back, and they found that the vast majority of economists, 96% of those they surveyed, were in agreement that the net economic impact of illegal immigration in particular was positive for the US economy. Again, that shouldn't be heard saying that there are no costs, only that the costs are less than the contributions. And one of the reasons that's true is that immigrants, even those who are unlawfully present, who are undocumented, are indeed paying taxes. I think that gets missed sometimes, but if you think about it, it's fairly logical. When you go to the grocery store and there's sales tax on your receipt, nobody asked you for your immigration legal status. People who are undocumented, and there's a lot of those folks there in California, pay those sales taxes just like anyone who's a citizen. In fact, in California alone, that accounted for almost $2 billion annually in recent years. Or the same is true with property taxes, whether you own a home and directly are paying those property taxes, or you are renting and your landlord is paying those taxes. There is a contribution there again in California alone, and these numbers are bigger than for any other state, but undocumented immigrants alone are paying more than $1 billion annually in property taxes just in California. And that's at the state and local level. Then when you look at the federal level, the numbers get, of course, even larger, including through payroll taxes. And that is sometimes a surprise to people because there's this idea of, well, if you're undocumented, if you're not here legally, you're working for cash off the books. And that does happen. But the Social Security Administration estimates that it's about 50% of undocumented workers in the United States who actually are on the books. That is to say, they get a paycheck or a direct deposit, just like most of the rest of us, and they have payroll taxes deducted from that paycheck for the Social Security Administration and Medicare and federal income taxes, and sometimes state income taxes. And the way that that basically works is that they are using a fake Social Security card. If any of you have looked at your Social Security card recently, it looks like it was made with blue construction paper and a typewriter. Like, we could probably come up with a more secure document in 2021 if we wanted to make sure that no one in this country was working without authorization. But the reality is there are all sorts of employers who benefit from the status quo, where they see something that looks like a Social Security card, they put that person on the payroll system, they take out money and send it to the federal government. The Social Security Administration, which is our source for these stats, is very well aware this is happening, but they don't send the money back. They send it on to my parents and to other people who have paid into the Social Security system in years past and are, deserve their Social Security contribution. But the challenge of this system is those individuals who could work for 20 or 30 years with that bogus Social Security number, which often has their name and an invented number on it, they cannot, when they turn 65, go and collect a Social Security benefit. Of course, that bogus Social Security number is not valid for any benefit in that case. In fact, the Social Security Administration says it receives about $12 billion per year from numbers that don't match the name on the card. And it ends up actually subsidizing Social Security for the rest of us. Not only is that true, but you can also actually file and pay your taxes at the federal level with what's called an individual taxpayer identification number, an ITIN. And that is a number that is specifically designed for someone who does not qualify for a Social Security number. So you can see sort of the duplicitous nature of our federal immigration system. On one hand, the Department of Homeland Security says these people should not be here, but the Internal Revenue Services says, but file and pay your taxes anyway. And we promise not to talk to the Department of Homeland Security, totally separate part of the federal government. And most immigrants who I know, and I go to a Spanish-speaking church where this is a very real dynamic for a lot of people, most of them do file and pay their taxes, and they've pretty well trusted the IRS not to turn that over to federal immigration enforcement authorities. I go through all that just because I think it is important to keep in mind that biblical principle that these are people made in the image of God. And with that comes the potential to create and to contribute. And we err if, as Christians, we look at people only, and I'm stealing this line from Mike Gerson, who worked for President Bush, but if we look at people only as mouths and not as hands and feet and brains, and forget that God has created them with the potential to contribute. Another really important biblical theme, and this is throughout the Bible and especially throughout the Old Testament, is that God has this particular concern for those who are vulnerable. And often in the Hebrew scriptures, when we read about vulnerable groups of people, there are three groups of people that get mentioned in the same passages. It's the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. Or depending upon your translation of the Bible into English, you might see sojourner, stranger, alien, immigrant. It's the Hebrew word ger that is sort of the idea of a resident foreigner. And that word alone appears 92 times just in the Old Testament. This is not just like one or two verses that we might have missed somewhere. This is actually a very frequent theme throughout the text. And often it's in the context of God telling the people of Israel, I love these people and you shall love them. That's basically Deuteronomy 10, 17 through 19. It's God not only saying he loves these vulnerable people, but then establishing specific rules to ensure that the needs of these vulnerable groups of people could be met. And if you think about it, an orphan who is not likely to have inherited wealth, or a widow in a patriarchal society, or a foreigner who comes in from outside would often have not had access to land in an agrarian society. But God was looking out for those people and ensuring, not with a handout system, but there was a means by which they could have their most basic needs met. So he tells the people of Israel not only love these people, but he sets up laws to ensure that their needs could be provided for. He tells the people of Israel, when you go through your crops, your olives, your wheat, your grapes, you should go through everything one time and leave what remains for the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. And when you fast forward into the Old Testament and get to the story of Ruth, who was a foreigner who came into the land of Israel, who's also a widow, what does she do when she needs to feed herself? She goes to the fields to glean, which if you don't have the context can feel kind of a little strange, but clearly she knew, and maybe from her mother-in-law, who was a cultural insider, that was what she was entitled to.
Que ella tenía el derecho, bajo la ley.
Another really important biblical theme for pretty much everything we think about, but certainly including immigration, is the command to love our neighbor. And we find that in its first instance in the Old Testament, in Leviticus chapter 19. God tells the people of Israel, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then just a few verses later in Leviticus 19:33 and 34, it says, when foreigners reside with you in your land, you shall not mistreat them. The foreigners residing among you shall be to you as your native born. You shall love them as yourselves, for you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. So even if we just were looking at Leviticus 19, we could conclude that that command to love as ourselves is very broad. It doesn't just include those who are just like us. But Jesus then underscores this and highlights this and leaves no room for doubt, because in the Gospels, he's asked, well, what's the greatest commandment? And he affirms that it is to love God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. But the lawyer, the legal scholar who's questioning him, he has a follow-up question. And it tells us in the text, he wants to justify himself. So you get the sense he would like a very precise legal answer. He says, well, who is my neighbor? But Jesus doesn't give a precise legal answer that would easily be checked off. Well, your neighbors, the people who live 3 doors down on either side, as long as they're of the same language and ethnicity and religion as you. Instead, Jesus tells what we think of as the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's worth noting that a Good Samaritan, for the average Jewish listener at that time, would have been an oxymoron. The Samaritans were not good. They were ethnically and religiously different, and not just different, but disliked. And we see that at various other points in the Gospels. Some of Jesus's best disciples at one point suggest calling down fire on a Samaritan village. When some of Jesus's critics want to insult him, they say, isn't it true that you're demon-possessed and a Samaritan? Which, tells you sort of the status that Samaritans had in that society. But Jesus's approach to Samaritans consistently throughout the Gospels is very countercultural. In various points, including here in Luke 10, where he doesn't just say you shall love your neighbor even if they're a Samaritan. he makes a Samaritan the hero of the story, the model we are given of what it looks like to love your neighbor as yourself. Of course, we are all familiar with that story. You know, the priest and the Levite see this guy beaten on the side of the road. They walk on by, don't help him. But the Samaritan who does stop, who has compassion on him, is the model that Jesus says of someone who has shown love for his neighbor. And we are told to go and do likewise. And I think one obvious takeaway for us as Christians thinking about how do we think about issues of immigration is that the neighbor whom we are called to love cannot be narrowly defined to those who share our ethnicity or our religion or our nationality. In fact, it could be just about anyone. Another takeaway of this command to love our neighbor is it doesn't come with an asterisk. It doesn't say, love your neighbor so long as it's totally safe. Because if you think about that story, you know, what scholars tell us about that road to Jericho is that it actually had something of a reputation of the sort of place where people would be beaten and robbed and left to die. And so the Samaritan, probably much like the priest and the Levite in that story, might have been very prudent from a human perspective to not stop and linger on a dangerous road, because there could have been some danger for him. You know, it would be sort of human wisdom to say, just don't stop, don't put yourself at risk, get out of there as quickly as you can. But our hero in this story is someone who does stop, who puts himself at risk out of love for this vulnerable neighbor. And I hear that, it reminds me of some of the churches that World Relief partners with in the Middle East or in parts of Africa, where they're facing very large challenges of displaced people, of refugees pouring across a national border to a neighboring country. And churches are really heroically serving incredible numbers of people, far more than I've seen churches in the United States responding to. And they're not doing so because they have great confidence in the vetting process at that border. They would not be paranoid to wonder if some of the bad people could sneak in with some genuine refugees just fleeing the bad people. But they're still serving them. And not because they're confident it is totally safe, but because they were never under the impression that following Jesus was going to be safe. And that is very challenging to me as an American Christian, because the irony is, for American Christians, welcoming refugees and other immigrants is actually very safe. And we have lots of data on that to know that. So refugees are a good example. Again, refugees are a subcategory of immigrants who are invited to the United States because of the persecution they've experienced. It's only a very small share of the world's refugees who ever get that invitation. So again, there's 26 million refugees in the world. Last year was a uniquely low year, but last year less than 10,000 refugees came to the United States. Some of that was COVID, but other policy changes. But even through our history, it's never been more than about 220,000 refugees per year. And that's still obviously a very small fraction of the world's refugees. But for those who do get even the option to be considered for resettlement to the United States, they go through an incredibly thorough vetting process. It's actually the most thorough vetting that our government has for any category of visitor or immigrant who comes into the United States. It involves multiple agencies of the US federal government, involves an in-person interview with an officer of the US Department of Homeland Security. And it usually takes about 18 months to complete once you're even being considered. And it's been remarkably successful since the Refugee Act was signed into law. In fact, I believe it was signed into law 41 years ago yesterday by President Carter. Since that time, there's been more than 3 million refugees resettled into the United States, and a grand total of 0 Americans have lost their life in a terrorist attack perpetrated by someone who came in through that refugee resettlement process. Now, that's not to say the risk is absolutely 0 or that we can't improve that vetting process, but it is a misconception that we don't have a vetting process or that it has somehow been a failure. It's actually been remarkably effective. Now, some would say, okay, so refugees go through this great vetting process. That's good to know. But what about other immigrants, including those who are here unlawfully, who might have snuck into the country without ever being noticed? And I think that is a fair concern. And obviously in Southern California, it's a proximate concern. You're near to the border. At World Relief, we've said for a long time that we think it's right and appropriate for our government to have secure borders, to do what is reasonably possible to ensure that to ensure that they know who's coming in and going out, and that no one seeking to harm the United States would be able to get in. We think that's an appropriate function of government as God has ordained it. What's not fair to conclude is that those who have come in unlawfully are somehow disproportionately a threat to our public safety. And we know that just, again, from data, because most of the immigrants who are undocumented, who've been here in the United States unlawfully, most of them have been here for at least 10 years. So if they were here to commit crimes, they would have had the opportunity to do so, and they have not done so, not disproportionately at least. Of course, some immigrants have committed crimes, but on the whole, if you look at FBI crime data, immigrants, whether they are lawfully present or not lawfully present, have lower crime rates than native-born U.S. citizens. And one way to measure this is looking at incarceration rates. So among adults 18 to 54, for the last year we have data for, it was about 1.5% of native-born U.S. citizens who incarcerated, about 0.4% of lawfully present immigrants, and about 0.8% of unlawfully present immigrants, which includes those who are detained because of an immigration violation. So they may or may not have been charged with a crime, but they may be waiting for an asylum hearing, and that still isn't included in these figures. I go through that not to tell you to be afraid of your U.S. citizen neighbors, just that it is not particularly rational to be uniquely afraid of your immigrant neighbors, because when we look at the data, they actually commit crime at lower rates than native-born U.S. citizens. One caveat to that is immigrants are no more likely than citizens to commit crime. They are more likely to be victims of crime. And that is actually particularly true of those who might come from a culture where they have learned not to trust the police and don't report crimes when they are victimized, or where a large share of people are undocumented and are afraid that they might be asked about their legal status. And criminals of various sorts have learned that this is true, that there are certain communities that are less likely to report when they're victimized. And the effect is that immigrants actually are victims of crime more often than native-born U.S. citizens. All of that is to underscore, the role of the government is important to maintain security, and I would completely affirm that. But I think sometimes we've been so focused on the question of, is the government doing their job? Are they securing the borders? Are they vetting people appropriately? That we as the church have forgotten to ask the question that we should be leading with, which is, who is my neighbor? And it's pretty clear biblically that our neighbor includes vulnerable immigrants of various sorts. Now, I just introduced the reality of people who are immigrants unlawfully in the country. Again, that's not all immigrants by any means. It's probably about 25% of the immigrants in our country. But for a lot of American Christians, that's a real tension point. They might agree that we should, generally speaking, love immigrants and welcome them and evangelize them and serve them. But what about immigrants who are unlawfully in the country? What do we do with that biblically? Because we have commands to love and welcome immigrants. And on the other hand, we have passages like in Romans 13, where we are told to be subject to the governing authorities. Where later in that passage, Paul writes that God has established government, and the government does not bear the sword without reason. So most Christians would understand that to mean that we do not have the privilege to simply dismiss the government that God has put over us, or ignore laws that we find inconvenient. Now, clearly, the Apostle Paul can't have meant that the law is always right and just. I mean, he was writing in the context of Rome. He would later be imprisoned by the Roman government, or he was imprisoned by the Roman government. There was all sorts of biblical examples of governments behaving unjustly, whether you think about the Hebrew midwives who didn't want to throw babies into the river, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not worshiping an idol. I guess you could argue that they were subject to the governing authorities and that they did not begin a violent revolution against Nebuchadnezzar. They went to the fiery furnace. They accepted the consequences legally for an unjust law. But still, we have this general principle that we are called to be subject to the governing authorities. So we can't just say, well, we don't care what the law says, we're going to do what we want. And so for a lot of Christians in the United States, this is where the tension comes, is should we love and welcome people, or should we follow the law? And I'm happy to report that I know the answer, and the answer is yes. And the good news is that there's not an inherent contradiction in those ideas. The good news is if we're going to take following the governing authorities seriously, it will lead you to the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is, I don't have a copy with it here in my office. I've got a copy of the INA, it's the immigration laws. It's a book thicker than my Bible and far less interesting. Our immigration laws are incredibly complex, but where they're not all that complex is as it relates to a church as an institution, or an individual U.S. citizen who might be interacting with an immigrant. There's not a law that says that if you suspect someone is unlawfully in the country, you're required to report that. There's not a law that says you can't provide help to someone if you know that they are unlawfully in the country. For example, that you can't teach English classes, or run a food pantry, or share the gospel with someone, or serve them communion, or teach them Sunday school, or let them teach Sunday school to you. I would say the one legal caveat would be, unless you're compensating them for teaching Sunday school, then it could be employment, and then there could be some legal issues. That part of the law is fairly black and white. But in terms of any of the sort of ministry to immigrants that any church would be likely to engage in, those things are not unlawful at the federal level or in the state of California. Now, I should add the warning that that could change. In fact, for World Relief as an organization, we've been serving immigrants since the 70s in the United States, but to my knowledge, we hadn't taken a position on immigration policy until in 2006, when a bill was passed. It was actually passed at the end of 2005. That would have made it it was passed only in the House of Representatives. It would have made it a felony to knowingly assist someone who was present unlawfully in the country in furtherance of their unlawful status. Well, that bill did not pass the Senate. It didn't get signed by President Bush, so it did not become law. But it got close enough to becoming law that we were concerned as an organization, as a ministry, about what it would mean for us if it did become law. Would it mean that the English classes that we run with local church partners could be considered unlawful? Of course, we are providing assistance, at least that's the goal. Are our ESL teachers who might, we don't as a rule ask everyone about their legal status, but they might know their students' stories and know that some of them are not lawfully present. Would they be committing a felony by knowingly assisting them? Is it in furtherance of their unlawful status? Frankly, there's no answer to that question because it didn't become law. It didn't go to a judge to decide. But we were very concerned that it could have been a very severe restriction on our religious freedom, because we do not fundamentally believe that it is the role of the government to tell the church, you're allowed to minister to these people, but you cannot minister to these other people. To quote Rick Warren, a good Samaritan doesn't stop and ask the injured person, are you legal or illegal? And we would say we don't think we should be required to do that. Now, of course, this Romans 13 command, be subject to the governing authorities, is a little bit more complicated for our brothers and sisters who are themselves undocumented. And there are many of those people, especially in Southern California, but throughout the United States. A lot of undocumented immigrants are strong believers. Some of them came here as Christians. Some of them were not Christians when they came, but met Jesus along the way. And I always think of this one particular guy in my neighborhood where I used to live. He's from Mexico. He came to the United States probably almost 30 years ago now, with his wife and his small children at a point of economic desperation. He could not make it economically. And he crossed the border legally, built his life here, was not a believer at the time, but at some point along the way, someone told him about Jesus, and he made a decision to follow Jesus, and it radically transformed his life. He started reading his Bible. Eventually, he went to Bible college. He's a lay leader in his church, and he is aware of Romans chapter 13, and he struggles with Romans 13. He doesn't want to be here illegally. I think it's important to know that the vast majority of undocumented immigrants are actually desperate to get right with the law. They would be thrilled for that opportunity. What I think a lot of Americans don't understand, and this was certainly my case before I started working in immigration law, was that that's simply not possible under current US law without some sort of a change. Of course, they could go back to their country of origin, and some have considered that. I know immigrants who have really wrestled with that as sort of a matter of personal conscience. Do I need to return to my country of origin? And I know some who've actually made that choice, but I also know some who I wouldn't fault who've not made that choice because it's incredibly complicated. They would point to, well, I'm wrestling with this personally, but my wife isn't feeling the same level of conviction. And of course, I want to keep my marriage together, but she's not going back there. Or my kids who were born here and they're citizens, it wouldn't be going back for them. It would be going to a totally different country to jump into an education in a language in which they've never been educated in. Or even biblically, there's commands in 1 Timothy to everyone must provide for his immediate family, and especially his immediate family. That weighs on a lot of our brothers and sisters in Christ who feel this biblical mandate to provide for their families, and yet felt like they couldn't do so in their countries of origin. And so, I've had friends ask me, what should I do in this situation? I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that question. What I do know is that I would love for there to be the opportunity for people to get right with the law. The reason they can't do that right now is simply how our laws are structured. So your opportunity to come lawfully to the United States is limited to basically 4 categories. And I won't go through this in detail. And if any of you happen to be immigration lawyers, there are a few minor exceptions to these general rules, but in general, you have family sponsorship. That means you've got a US citizen who, or in some cases, a lawful permanent resident, the green card, who files a petition for a loved one abroad. Not an extended family member, not your grandparents, your cousins, your uncles or aunts, but a parent, if the sponsor is over 21, a child, a spouse, or a sibling. Then you have other cases where it's an employer who's sponsoring someone. And I should say with those family sponsored cases, sometimes those are quick. Sometimes they literally are waits of decades, more than 20 years. Then you have employer sponsorship. That means you've got a company in the United States who's going to petition for a worker to come and fill a key role in their business. But the vast majority of those employer sponsored immigrant visas are explicitly reserved for those who are considered highly skilled. So if you don't have a master's degree, you are probably very unlikely to qualify for one of those visas. The third possibility is refugee status or asylum. So again, those are only for those who have not just fled poverty or fled a natural disaster or some sort of generic hardship, but have fled persecution for one of those specific reasons under the law. And again, since a very small share of the world's refugees get selected overseas, the fact that you are indeed a refugee does not mean you get a golden ticket to come to the United States. It's less than 0.5% who get selected in a given year. And that asylum is your last option is part of why we see so many people trying to get to the United States to request asylum, because it is basically their last legal opportunity and it requires getting to the United States. The last possibility is something called the diversity visa lottery. It's an online lottery that you enter on the State Department's website. In a normal year, the odds of winning are somewhere around 1 in 400, which is better than one of those scratch-off games at the gas station, but not very good. Most people don't win. And to even enter that lottery, you cannot be from Mexico or El Salvador, India, China, South Korea, the Philippines, Canada. Any of the countries that already send the most immigrants to the United States do not qualify to enter the diversity visa lottery. And I go through all that because it's easy to tell people, well, you should wait your turn in line. But the reality is that the vast majority of immigrants who are here unlawfully could not have come lawfully no matter how long they waited. They simply didn't qualify for any of those lines. A few of them could have, and a few of them who are here unlawfully might have an opportunity to adjust their status. The legal counselors on my colleagues who do legal work who I've talked to would say it's probably 5 to 10% of undocumented immigrants, if they had good legal counsel, might have an opportunity to get legal status, but the vast majority do not, at least under current law. And that's where, as World Relief, as we say, how do we both honor the law and also be compassionate and keep families together? We would love to see some sort of a reform that would not be an amnesty. We don't think an amnesty that just says that the law was broken, but the law doesn't matter. That doesn't really honor the law the way Romans 13 would have us to do as a society. But also would not be a mass deportation policy, which of course would inherently divide literally millions of families. I mean, the numbers would be, because you have all these US citizen kids who can't be deported legally. So what we've said is there ought to be a way for people to come forward, acknowledge violation of an immigration law, and pay some sort of a fine as a form of restitution for having violated the law, and then be able to earn permanent legal status and eventually citizenship if they're willing to fulfill certain requirements. If we paired that with making it harder to immigrate illegally, so improving border security, and making it easier to immigrate legally, so that those who want to fill a job or to be reunited to family or to find safety from persecution would have greater opportunities, we think that the system would function much better. And that's basically the 3 pillars of what's been called comprehensive immigration reform. It's what President Bush pushed back in 2006. President Obama pushed it in 2013. So it's not historically had this partisan divide. But World Relief at both of those points was very supportive in saying, we think this would be a significant improvement over the status quo. And though I don't see a lot of momentum towards that politically right now, we continue to believe that that would be the best way to both honor the law and be worthy of a compassionate nation that values the dignity of each immigrant. Going back to the scriptures, another biblical theme that I think is important to think through is that a lot of immigrants were persecuted, as I said, refugees, for example, and many of those who are seeking asylum. And sometimes the persecution that they've experienced is actually on account of their faith in Jesus. If you go back to that definition of a refugee, it's someone who's fled a credible fear of persecution on account of several reasons, but one of which is religion. And it turns out that the religion that gets more people in our world in trouble today than any other is actually Christianity. And when I talk about persecution for your faith, sometimes I think we have a warped view of this in the United States. I'm not talking about like your Starbucks cup didn't say Merry Christmas. I'm talking about people whose lives were at risk because they insist on being a follower of Jesus. People who were forced out of their community, often forced out of their country, to live in a refugee camp, sometimes for decades, because of their faith in Jesus and their refusal to renounce that. The top country of origin for refugees resettled to the United States in the last decade is actually Burma or Myanmar in Southeast Asia. And if you're following the news, there are really horrifying things happening in Burma right now with their government, but that government, frankly, has been really horrifying for a long time and has persecuted a variety of religious minorities. So it's a Buddhist majority country. Muslim Rohingya refugees have been horrifyingly persecuted in recent years. But also, actually, the majority of Burmese refugees to come to the United States in the last decade are Christians. Many of them Baptists, some Anglicans, some Catholics, and they have been persecuted in part, at least, because of their faith in Christ. Also, often they're ethnic minorities also, and those things kind of go together in that context. But, you know, I lived in an apartment complex for many years where many of my neighbors were Burmese Christian refugees, and in fact, there was a church that met in the apartment underneath mine, and I would know that church was happening because there'd be about 36 sets of shoes outside the door, because Burmese people don't wear shoes inside the house. And then, you know, loud worship music, which I never complained about because I'm not going to complain about worship music, even if it was keeping me awake. But frankly, those were some of the best neighbors I've ever had. I have had them literally at my door to tell me about Jesus. And frankly, though I've been a Christian for most of my life, I have some things to learn about following Jesus from those brothers and sisters who have been persecuted for their faith, who know what it is to sacrifice and to walk in the steps of Jesus, carrying their cross. In a sense, when we welcome them, we're welcoming Jesus himself. Matthew 25, Jesus says, "I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me." And the disciples say to Jesus, "Wait, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or sick or in prison or a stranger?" And Jesus says, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did unto me. And whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do unto me." One thing I think is important to acknowledge is that, as many of you are aware, the U.S. government has dramatically reduced the number of refugees who've been allowed into the United States in the last several years. And that has affected refugees of all religious traditions, but it has particularly affected some of the most persecuted Christians in the world. So, for example, this data is from a report that World Relief did with Open Doors USA. This is the number, excuse me, this is the number of Christian refugees of any Christian tradition from the 50 countries on the Open Doors USA World Watch list of countries that face persecution of Christians. So you can see there it went down from more than 18,000 from those 50 countries. Again, this is just of Christians. In 2015, down to, you know, obviously you can see the trend line there, down to just over 1,000 last year by the end of the year. This was mid-year data, but mid-year with COVID, resettlement almost completely stopped as well. So numbers went down dramatically. Some of that was a result of COVID, but obviously that was not why the numbers were going down in 2017 and 2018 and 2019. That was the federal policy to dramatically reduce the overall number of refugees. And as a result, Christians were affected along with Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and others. Now, I should add, we're optimistic, though there's been no change at this point. The new president has announced that they'll be raising the refugee ceiling, which we think would impact refugees of all backgrounds. That has not yet happened as we're recording this, but we hope that that will happen soon at World Relief. I mentioned refugees of non-Christian backgrounds. I think if we're honest, if it was all Christian refugees persecuted for their faith, refugees wouldn't be quite so controversial in the church. But the reality is, I think a lot of American Christians hear refugee and they think of someone coming from Syria who's a Muslim, or Somalia, or Iraq. And those are a significant share of refugees. They're not the majority. Most years, Muslims have been a minority of refugees, but it's a significant share. And some Americans and some American Christians see that as a threat. They see that as a, you know, that people are different than them coming into their communities who do not share their faith. But our view of World Relief has always been that this is actually a remarkable missional opportunity, an opportunity to live out that great commission that Jesus left us with, to make disciples of all nations, which of course we can do by sending missionaries to different parts of the world. But, it's really hard to send missionaries to certain parts of the world. It's dangerous. They do not have religious freedom there. People have to make up pretenses for why they're going there. And if they are found, they could be harmed. If someone makes the decision to convert to Christianity, they could be even more severely harmed in many cases. So we have missed something really profound if we don't notice that God in his sovereignty has sent people from all of those nations to the United States, to a country where we are blessed with religious freedom, where we are free to share our faith, and people are free to receive it or to reject it. And to be really clear, we are big believers in that religious freedom, which means we don't trick anyone into following Jesus. We don't say, we'll serve you better, or we'll only serve you if you embrace Jesus and come to our church. We don't put any pressure on people at all. But we do believe in evangelism rightly understood, which is an open invitation to a relationship with Jesus. And frankly, when we do our job of loving our neighbors as ourselves, which we're called to do whether someone would ever share our faith or not, when we do that, it's rare that sooner or later they don't ask the question, why? And we get to, as 1 Peter 3:15 says, to be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that is within you, and to do so with gentleness and respect. And we've seen all sorts of opportunities as we partner with local churches, again, not under any sort of coercion or hard sales pitch, but when teams from local church serve the refugees who are arriving, who are of other religious backgrounds well, they often are going to ask questions about faith before most American Christians feel comfortable bringing it up. Because for a lot of people in the world, religion is a daily part of life. It's a part of their culture in many cases as well. And people presume that most Americans are Christians, and they'll have questions. And often this comes up, for example, around holidays. So you guys are Christians, you celebrate Christmas, and you believe in this big fat guy in a red suit. Well, that's not actually an important theological belief. It's more of a cultural dynamic. But that's an opportunity to talk about who we believe Jesus is, to talk about this crazy story of the incarnation, of God becoming a human being. And that is an incredibly compelling story. It's also a confusing story, and one that, for people from other backgrounds, they'll have lots of questions about. And we're not there to force that down their throats, but we've seen lots of people make the decision in the United States to become followers of Jesus. I also think of this one guy in my neighborhood. He's from Somalia, which, if you know anything about Somalia, it's not a lot of Christians in Somalia. It's one of the least reached countries. And he actually came to my friend Josh, who was his English teacher and lived in the same apartment complex with us. And he said, Josh, in my refugee camp in Ethiopia, I heard about this movie called The Jesus Film. Can you get me that in my language? It wasn't that Josh was a great evangelist at his door. He was coming to him. He knows he's a Christian, and he wants to know more about who Jesus is. And it's an opportunity for us to point people to that, the hope of a relationship with Jesus. I should add that that's not automatic. Some people might think, well, there's plenty of Christians in Southern California. If people are not Christians, they'll eventually encounter them. But that's not necessarily true. The Center for the Study of Global Christianity at Gordon Conwell Seminary found that among people of non-Christian religious traditions in North America, so this includes a lot of refugees and asylees and other immigrants, the majority of those people, majority of those people, 60%, say they do not personally know a Christian. Not that they've never been to church or they've never read the Bible, but they don't personally know a Christian. And we might say, wow, those people need to get out more. But maybe we need to do a better job of going into their neighborhoods, of loving them as our neighbors. And in the context, we might have that opportunity to point people to a relationship with Jesus. J.D. Payne, who's a missiologist down in Alabama, says that something is missionally malignant whenever we're willing to make great sacrifices to travel the world to reach a people group, but are not willing to walk across the street. So I want to close, and then we'll turn to Q&A in just a few minutes, but with a few practical thoughts on what this looks like. And so we've developed this acronym of PLEASE, which starts with prayer. And that's not just because LEASE wasn't a great acronym. We really believe that prayer should be the foundation for engaging any difficult issue as Christians. The second point there is listening. Listening first and foremost to the scriptures. That statistic from our survey with Lifeway Research that only 12% of evangelical Christians think about immigration primarily as a biblical issue is rather scandalous from my perspective. So we ought to start with, what does the Bible say? And I put a website there. I don't think you can click it, but we'll be able to send this link around. The Evangelical Immigration Table, which World Relief helped to start and includes the National Association of Evangelicals and a bunch of other Christian groups. Some years ago, we put together a 40-verse Bible reading guide. You can also find it, if you go to that link, there's a link to YouVersion's Bible app. So it'll just pop up on your phone every day with a verse, or you can print out a bookmark and stick it in your Bible. We found that's a great starting point, especially for people who may not have realized the Bible said anything on this topic. Turns out it says a great deal. And listening also, obviously starting with the scriptures, but also very importantly would be listening to the stories of immigrants themselves. For me, it was, my introduction to this issue was volunteering with World Relief with a refugee family from Rwanda, and then ultimately moving into their neighborhood and getting to know that family, and they became my mentors in understanding immigration issues. They helped me understand both where they had come from and why they had made the decision to come, and the challenges that they faced in the United States. They are a family of just incredible Christian faith who has relied on Jesus through some really difficult circumstances, both there and frankly here. And hearing that sort of story and hearing the diversity of stories that there are is incredibly important for us as we think through this issue. The E in that acronym is empowering churches abroad. Immigration is usually a decision made under some element of duress. It's not usually people's first choice. It's usually when something is pushing them out of their country of origin. And that can be poverty, it can be persecution, it can be other sorts of violence or war, it can be environmental degradation. But our view of World Relief, of course, is we want to welcome people who make the decision to come, but we also think it's a tragedy that anyone would feel that they have no choice but to come, but to leave their country behind. So one of the things we do at World Relief, and there's lots of other good organizations that do this, is to work alongside local churches in other parts of the world who are serving people who are vulnerable. And that's something, if you're interested in, World Relief loves to partner with you. You can go to our website, it's listed there, Church Path, worldrelief.org/churchpath, and see opportunities to do that. And I apologize, my screen just went black. I hope you can still see it. There we go. The A in that acronym is advocacy. Advocacy, I think an easy definition of advocacy is in Proverbs 31, verse 8. It is to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. I always want to add the caveat to that command that immigrants can speak for themselves. I just told you to listen to them. So clearly they are not mute. But in terms of public policies, most politicians care a lot about people who can vote, who are citizens. If you're not a citizen and can't participate in their reelection one way or the other, they often are less concerned what you think about. And that is, that may or may not be fair, but it's a reality. And that's where I think those of us who do happen to be citizens have a stewardship opportunity, maybe responsibility, to speak up, not just for our own interests, but also for the interests of those who are vulnerable, whose voices aren't likely to be heard by those setting the policies that can impact them. So one way that we've done that at World Relief is through the Evangelical Migration Table, as I mentioned, and we bring our voice along with the National Association of Evangelicals and the Southern Baptist Convention and World Vision and the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities and various other groups. And I know the Free Methodist Church has been a part of that, particularly through the National Association of Evangelicals. But even right now, we have a sign-on letter to our members of Congress urging them to move forward on immigration legislation. You can find that and add your name if you want to at evangelicalmigrationtable.com/reform. And there you can see other policy dynamics there, as well as a bunch of discipleship tools for churches. The S in that acronym is serving locally. There are all sorts of very practical needs that immigrants face, whether they're refugees or asylum seekers or others, as they first arrive in a new country. And obviously there's lots of ways that local churches are doing that. World Relief does have an office in Garden Grove in Orange County that if they can help you with that, they would be thrilled to do so. My colleagues there are fantastic, and so you can go to their website to learn more. But there's all sorts of very practical, tangible needs in immigrant communities that the church can be a part of addressing. And that then goes hand in hand with evangelism, that as we serve people, as we advocate with them, as we love them as our neighbors, we get the opportunity to point people to a relationship with Jesus. And again, you shouldn't be surprised when you're ready to share the gospel with someone if they share the gospel right back at you, because a lot of the immigrants who come into our country, most by some measures, it's hard to measure faith exactly, but at least most immigrants profess to be Christians of one sort or another. And many of them bring just a very vibrant Christian faith that many of us in the United States have a lot to learn from. But there are others who don't know Jesus, and there comes this opportunity to point people to him who might never have encountered him had they stayed in their country of origin, but whom that will only happen for if the American church is ready to reach out with Christ-like love and welcome. last thing I'll close with is this quote from a famous California governor, Ronald Reagan. This was actually his farewell address in 1989. And I like this because I just think it's kind of poetic and a nice place to close. He said this: "I've thought a bit of the shining city upon a hill. In my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds, living in harmony and peace. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here." Now, again, I like that quote. In some ways, it encapsulates what I would like to see as a U.S. immigration policy. But I also think it's important to note that President Reagan gets at least something a little bit wrong. And that is, I didn't include this in the quote, but he credits John Winthrop, the Puritan early colonist to the United States, for that phrase of a shining city upon a hill. But of course, any of us who know our Bibles know that phrase that the idea of a city on a hill doesn't come from John Winthrop. And it actually wasn't meant to describe the United States of America. In fact, it was the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 5. And he was talking not to the US or to any nation state, but to the earliest disciples, to the church. And he says this in Matthew 5: "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they would see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven." And that's really my prayer as we think about this issue of immigration and as the church, regardless of what our country does, is that people who are vulnerable would see the response of the church, and that it would not be a response of apathy or even hostility or fear, but it would be a response of love and welcome and advocacy. And that both those who already know Jesus and those who might not yet would give glory to our Father in heaven. And that's, I think the story's still to be written, if that's to be true or not, but that's my prayer. I know for us at World Relief, that's really our heart, is to help the church step into that place of being a shining city on a hill. So with that, I will close and we can take Q&A. I think my understanding is you can do that using the Q&A feature on, not the chat feature, because if I have to monitor both, I'll get confused. So if you can plug things into the Q&A, and I should say, this was fairly general biblical presentation. I know that there are dynamics with immigration as we speak at the border. And in terms of policy, I'm happy to answer policy questions or biblical questions, or I'm always impressed if I get a question I've never heard before. So do your best to.
Well, Matthew, thank you so much for that. Wonderfully informative. And yeah, I will let everybody know two things. One, please, if you have a question, post it down below and we'll bring that up. Two, this video, like all of our Thursday videos, will be made available, and we'll send out the links for you following this so that you can share it broadly and widely. Matthew, one question that I was thinking about, this presentation, so wonderful in the stats that you brought to frame the issue for leaders. But beyond that, what have you found to be the most effective tool or conversation that the average person can have with another to bring awareness and engagement to this issue?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think I would say I've found that there are different personality types that respond differently to different angles. And
Sure.
So sometimes it's helpful to have a few tools in your toolbox. And again, I'm not necessarily putting these in order, but I would say stories are really powerful. I mean, I would say our general analysis is we can give a sermon on this topic like what I just shared at a church, and it probably moves the needle in terms of the average person goes from being a little unsure, but some element of hostility, especially in a mostly white evangelical church, to still a little unsure, but maybe mostly more positive. Maybe there's a 10-point shift. The people who become actually do something, who go meet their immigrant neighbors and advocate with them, are the people who have a relationship. That's what really changes people's hearts and minds.
Always.
And sometimes we can help facilitate that. It's not a relationship, but we can share a testimony on a Sunday morning, or, and especially the more commonality we can point to, it's not just an immigrant, it's an immigrant who's in your denomination, who shares your theological beliefs, who is with you on mission, and yet you haven't heard their story and what they've gone through.
Yeah.
And I say, there's a lot of people that will be very motivating. Other people will feel manipulated by that. So it's also good to have the stats ready to say, yeah, Maria just shared her story, and this was true of her. And it turns out that that's not an anomaly. Here's who most immigrants in this country are. Here's the crime rates and the economic data. Because for a lot of Americans, those are sort of the stumbling blocks that they can't quite get past. because they hear that every night of the week if they're watching certain television channels. And, as pastors, you get one Sunday a week at best, usually. And it's hard to compete with that. I certainly understand that. But just to be mindful that, again, people are coming from very different places. But for those who are consuming that media, it's a lot to overcome, and pointing people to as unbiased sources of facts can be really helpful. And then the last thing, but maybe it should be the primary thing, is the Bible. Again, we find that many Christians, and this is true among white evangelicals, but also among a lot of non-white evangelicals in the US, they were included in that survey as well. They don't think about this primarily as a biblical issue. So how do we help start the conversation with the scriptures? That ought to be the common ground that if we are Christians, we ought to be able to agree on, even if we're not necessarily going to agree upon the ramifications of some of those passages. But that often we don't even know what the Bible says on this topic is a big problem.
That's huge. Thank you. Thank you for the answer. Follow-up question on a practical note. I heard you say, when we're talking about our practical activity as churches with illegal immigrants or refugees, that some of the legal impact, there's not much there, save category for employment. If we wanted to do that, we have very specific restrictions. Is there any overarching requirement or law or something that we as church leaders need to be aware of when we're working with that population that we need to report or that needs to inform our activity?
Yeah, I mean, the big area is employment, and there's not really a silver bullet like workaround to that. Like, I mean, I've had churches say, well, can I like pay someone in gift cards to Walmart? Is that then not employment? I'm not telling you that's good or bad. I'll just tell you from the view of the US government, that's still employment. If there's compensation for a work performed. Now, can you give out gift cards at your food pantry with no strings attached? Yes, you can. But if it is kind of quid pro quo, you do this and I give you this, the government would consider that employment. Now, I know Christians who would say, well, that's an opportunity for civil disobedience, like what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are doing. Most denominations probably wouldn't endorse that view because there could be legal liabilities to it. The other area that sometimes come up is the laws regarding harboring. And we've had churches that are concerned, well, if someone's coming into our service, are we harboring them? The way the courts have interpreted that law for a long time, and I really cannot see this, I mean, I think it would take a change in law, not just a new court decision to change this, is that harboring is when you are intentionally assisting someone to evade law enforcement. So if ICE comes to your church, which has occasionally happened, though it is unlikely to happen because they have non-binding internal policies that say not to go to what they call sensitive locations, which would include churches. So in general, they're not going to show up at your church anyway, though I am aware of a few circumstances where it's occurred. But if they come to your church and say, is Jose Luis here? And Jose Luis is standing behind you and you say, nope, don't know who that is. That's a possibility you might be considered to be intentionally evading law enforcement. Now, what you could say is not, nope, I don't know who he is, but do you have a warrant? That's a fair question. It is not, a church is private property and you can let them in, but you don't have to let them in unless they go get a warrant. If they want to get a warrant, they can come anywhere they want.
Interesting. And what about just a follow up and a real practical? What about having people from this population serve on boards and committees or in ministries like Youth and Children, where background checks are required, and how is it viewed from that standpoint?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there you're less, there's not legal issues. So for example, even like a lot of denominations have asked questions like, can we ordain this person? The First Amendment gives you a lot of freedom to decide who to ordain and who not to ordain. And it's a pretty good protection that the government is not going to set rules on who you can ordain. Now, they do set rules on who you can pay, but there are pastors who are ordained who are not compensated. In terms of background checks, it's a really good question, one that comes up often. There's not a law there. Well, I don't know. I mean, there could be laws state by state, but in general, most churches are doing background checks on youth volunteers out of prudence, not necessarily out of a legal requirement that, that the government is requiring that of them. I don't know if there's any states where that would be true, but in general, it's more of a best practice for very good reasons, obviously, not a legal requirement. that gets tricky if the background check service you use is based on a social security number. There are background checks you can do that are a little bit more costly and complicated, but are either based on fingerprints, and frankly, they're far more accurate than social security checks, which often miss some things. So there are some tools there. We have a few years ago, and we need to update this, but it's a few years back we did a Church Leaders Guide to Immigration, which I can pass on the link to. We have it on the Evangelical Immigration Table website under resources as well. But I know we recommended at least one company that does those kind of background checks there. There's a few. I know I was actually with a pastor yesterday. They have somehow worked something out with like an Interpol check. So they're checking backgrounds all over the world. So it's a little bit more complicated, and there's not an easy way around that. But yeah, most people won't be able to provide a social security number. And if you just leave it void, you're not actually getting a very good background check.
Yeah, that's right. And just for the reference here, the Free Methodist Church does fully endorse the promoting of people through membership and into ordination, irrespective of their legal status, with the caveat that we cannot employ in that sense. So those are, if you're a leader listening or watching to this within the Free Methodist Church, please work with your local conference or with the denomination when you get to that place. There's a mechanism, a pathway to do it, and we want to promote that as is appropriate, but we want to be wise along the way. So, other questions that have come up? Anybody here?
While we're waiting, Matthew, thank you again for your time and really dispelling myths about economic contributions and taxes and terrorism. Really appreciate that. I'm wondering how, maybe like this, but how can we continue to keep our congregations informed or current? What would be the best way? Like, for example, just even something about informing them of these things that I just mentioned, but the immigration process, the asylum process, or even how do we stay current on political issues regarding immigration, without having to read that thick reference book you talked about,
Yeah. I don't wish that upon anyone. I mean, depending how engaged you want to be, obviously there's different levels of engagement. If you go to the Evangelical Immigration Table website, we do a monthly email there that it's actually mostly focused on prayer requests, but sometimes that'll be focused on what's happening right now. And we just last month we did virtual congressional meetings. So we had about 300 people who got onto a Zoom call like this, and we met with about 75 different congressional offices. So we'll make you aware of those opportunities if you want to sign up on our website. Again, we won't spam you more than about once a month. And then World Relief likewise has a lot of local opportunities. We do a lot of legal services. And again, I know Southern California is a big area, but kind of with an epicenter in the Orange County area. Yeah, like I'm on Twitter, and my wife would tell you I spend too much time there, but I try to, most of what I tweet about is somehow related to immigration or the church or both. So it's just my full name, Matthew Soerens. Yeah, those would be a few ideas. And then in terms of how you keep your congregations engaged, I guess one challenge I would give is that same survey we did that found 12% of evangelicals think biblically about this issue found that about 21% had ever heard a sermon on this issue. So we can blame them, but it also might be on us as leaders for not ever speaking to this. So, we've got sample sermons and stats and stories to help make that easier on the Evangelical Immigration Table website. But in my view, this comes up too frequently in scripture to never come up on a Sunday morning. And it is something that even though you may get some pushback from a few people in the congregation, that does happen occasionally. It's usually less than I think a lot of people anticipate it might be, because people actually really want to know what the Bible says on this. And they're often really yearning for that sort of, if we keep it on the Bible, and you'll notice I didn't tell you, so go vote for this candidate or that candidate. We are very intentionally nonpartisan. That doesn't mean to say we don't think the policy issues matter, but our goal, we don't take our cues for which policies matter or how to think about them from one party or the other. Our goal is to say, what do the scriptures say, and how can we, in our imperfect human judgment, prudentially apply those to some of the policy questions.
Thank you.
There's one question, Matthew, in the chat from Wendy about process for those who've suffered abuse and things like that. Can you speak to that issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the specific visas here are U visas and V visas, which it always intimidates me when people know about different categories of visas, because clearly you know what you're talking about. And then you'll notice if I said something wrong, but it is really worth bringing up. So U visas in particular are visas for victims of certain crimes. So there's a particular list of crimes that qualify. The idea when Congress put these visas into place was going to that dynamic that I mentioned, that immigrants are often victims of crime, and then they don't want to testify in court. They don't want to talk to the police. It makes it very difficult to get a conviction against a criminal who's done sometimes very egregious crimes, because nobody will talk to the police or the district attorney or whatever. The U visa is basically meant to be a tool for law enforcement. A law enforcement official, it could be a police department or a district attorney, can sign off on a certificate basically recommending a U visa for an individual who may be undocumented. And so basically it's telling them, if you, not only are we not going to penalize you for testifying, we can in some ways reward you for testifying, so that we can help convict this person who's committed a much more serious criminal offense than unlawfully crossing the border. There's a backlog for U visas, unfortunately. They have, and it also, because it requires local law enforcement, a lot of local law enforcement are very eager to help with this, and sometimes they're not. And there's not always much we can do about that. Like I can tell you in the Chicagoland area, when I hear someone was a victim of a crime, I start going to which police department was it? Because if it was this one, they're going to help us. And if it was this one, they never sign these. And that's an unfortunate reality that is sort of their, you know, there's some, they have some discretion there. But it's definitely worth notifying someone if they have, again, it's not every crime, but there's a certain, mostly violent crimes, domestic violence is included. And that unfortunately is one that comes up a lot. There's also the T visa specifically for victims of human trafficking, which obviously is a crime. And sometimes trafficking victims, a good legal practitioner can assess if a U visa or a T visa is going to be a better opportunity, but because it can be very difficult to meet the documentary evidence requirements for a T visa. But trafficking legally is when someone is made to work under situations of force, fraud, or coercion. So that doesn't just include immigrants. Plenty of trafficking victims are US citizens. But immigrants are disproportionately victims of human trafficking, both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And often they're undocumented, and often it is their lack of legal status that is a factor in why they didn't report what they were experiencing, because they were afraid. So it's a really important tool for offering some hope to those individuals.
Excellent.
Well, I'm wondering. Oh, there it is. Fraser is asking, Matthew, do you have a go-to book you would recommend help from being in this conversation?
I mean, I've got a list of books, but the self-serving one would be probably the two that I co-authored. So one is called Welcoming the Stranger with my colleague Jenny Yang, and that is from InterVarsity Press. We did an updated version of that a few years back, so it's hard to stay on top of immigration changes because they change all the time, but it's only a few years old. For those who are particularly interested in refugees and maybe a little bit more of a global perspective, I also did a book with Isam Smear and Stephen Bowman, 2016, called Seeking Refuge. Mm-hmm. And then there's a lot of other really great books. One, if you're really looking for a biblical theological perspective, there's an Old Testament scholar at Wheaton College Grad School named Daniel Carroll Rodas. His book, The Bible and Borders, is one that I have bought for too many people because I just think it's such a helpful scholarly perspective. Not scholarly like inaccessible, because I'm not a scholar, but for people who want to really go into the meat of what the Bible says, I recommend that one. My colleague Karen Gonzalez at World Relief has a book called The God Who Sees, which is it's sort of part memoir. She's an immigrant from Guatemala herself, but then interspersed with some theological reflections, and I think she does a great job. And I could go on. Part of my job is to read all the Christian books on immigration, and I'm very happy that there are more than one or two, which 10 years ago it was very limited.
Wow, thank you, Matthew. Thank you again for everything. I have one more request of you, but just curious. Want to ask, where do you see the fear trajectory going in the church? Is it still rising? Is it
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about fear is it's all over this conversation, right? I mean, there are a lot of immigrants who are afraid. There are a lot of immigrants who, who've worried that they could be deported and lose and not be allowed to live with their children or with their spouse. There is also a lot of fear among American citizens who are not immigrants, who have heard scary things about immigrants on the television, that they're terrorists or they're going to steal your job or they're the reason for whatever's wrong in the United States right now. And a lot of things, coronavirus wasn't caused by immigration, but there's plenty of people who would blame Asian immigrants for that. And we've seen some of the really horrifying consequences of that kind of rhetoric. But I think, I do think there's actually some hopeful news if you look at the public opinion surveys. The share of Americans who think, when asked by like Gallup, are immigrants a threat to our culture and values or are they a net benefit for our society? The share who thinks immigrants are a good thing is at basically an all-time high. And I don't know what accounts for that. Although if I had to guess, again, the best way to have a positive view of immigrants is to know a few. And we see that geographically. The parts of the country that have the most hostility to immigrants are parts of the country with almost no immigrants. So people's sole opinions are based on what they saw on television or in media. Where, I'm sure, I know there's people who don't like immigrants in Southern California, but it's hard to not know an immigrant if you live in Southern California. Like it's hard to not interact with some people born abroad because it's a huge share of the population in a way that, just frankly, it's not in Iowa or Nebraska. Not that there's no immigrants there, but they're harder to find than in a place like Southern California or Chicago or New York City or Miami. So I think as the country becomes more ethnically diverse, people are more likely to have had that interaction with someone and know their story. And again, immigrants are not angels. They're also not demons. They're human beings. They're sinful. They're also, made in the image of God, and they have complex stories just like the rest of us. And I don't think we do any favors by, just choosing sort of the valedictorians and the business owners and putting them on a pedestal. And this is what immigrants are. Of course, immigrants have all the same problems as other people, and any of you who pastor in that context know that. But they're not disproportionately prone to any sort of vices. They're just people just like the rest of us. And I think to understand that humanity is, I think, part of why we've seen some, more positive views towards immigrants. It's also worth noting, this is a historical ebb and flow. And if you go back 100 years ago, it was probably peak anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States. And frankly, it was largely driven by Protestant Christians who thought that immigrants were Catholic and could not possibly become American, or they were Jewish, and that was a problem. And a lot of the rhetoric of that time, we passed the most restrictive immigration laws in our history just about 100 years ago. And it coincided with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. It was a lot of similar ideologies. But the idea was basically those people are biologically inherently different from us. And again, they were mostly talking about Eastern Europeans at the time. Not to mention Africans or Asians, but it was largely a Eastern European immigration wave. 100 years ago, the share of the population that was foreign born was actually, at least like 105 years ago or so, was a little higher than it is now. People think, wow, we have this unprecedented level of immigration. That's true in terms of total numbers for sure, right? Because the population has grown. But the share of the population that's foreign born peaked right around the turn of the 20th century, or around 1900, 1910, that era. When, we think of Ellis Island, a lot of people can trace their roots for Ellis Island. And a lot of us have these kind of romantic ideas of Ellis Island, like those brave people who came and they learned English the day they got off the boat and pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. Some of that's true. Some of it obviously is a little mythologized. But what I think we forget is that those immigrants were not very popular with the American population who was there at the time, many of whom were only a generation or two from their own immigrant experience from Europe. And many of those people were Christians, and there's bright spots where that was not true, but often it was led by Christians who didn't want these new immigrants. I think that there's a biblical story to remember there, which has been God told the people of Israel to love the foreigner. It was because they had been foreigners in the land of Egypt. And I think the parallel for us is that whether you came last week or you came 400 or 500 years ago, whether you came on the Mayflower or a slave ship or into Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, as many of the Chinese did 100 years ago, we have immigrant stories for the most part ourselves. Sometimes forced immigrant stories, sometimes voluntary, but we all have those stories. And the lesson of Scripture is not to treat the new people just as bad as they treated our people, but to be better than Pharaoh. You cannot treat them as terribly as Pharaoh treated you. And I think that should be a lesson for American evangelicals and Christians as well.
Man, this is great. Wish you could continue on. We only have a couple of minutes left, so I want to invite you real quick with the time left. Do you have a call to action for us? What would you give us?
Yeah, I mean, I would to go back to the slide I gave you. I give you multiple calls to action. People are going to be in different places. Some of you are up to your nose in immigration issues. That's the context in which you minister. You know, first of all, I want you to know you're not alone, and I appreciate your denomination is talking about this issue. That doesn't frankly happen in every denomination. For those of you who are like, no, I pastor in a context where we're afraid to talk about this and people are not going to respond to it well, I'd really challenge you to spend some time in prayer. Start with the scriptures. Start maybe with that Bible reading guide. And then if you're like, yeah, I'm for this. For those of you who are ready for some form of advocacy, again, at the evangelicalmigrationtable.com, we would love more people to take part in that, because it's an opportunity, we think, in terms of public policy. You know, I'm not a prophet to tell you what will happen, but there at least is some hope on the horizon in terms of immigration policy changes that I wouldn't say I had a year ago with some of the momentum in terms of policy change.
Thank you. Well, thank you again. God bless you. We appreciate what a gift you are to the kingdom in this generation, and especially to us in this season. This is our vein, our heartbeat. So again, appreciate you. Well, everyone, God bless you. Thank you so much for connecting, tuning in, being community today. Much blessings to Matthew. And while we prepare to go, please be look out for the email and notices for our Thursday webinars for next month. Special prayers on your Holy Week events and festivities and all that you are planning. God's hand and fruitfulness abiding in all that you are doing. Prayers are always increasing, and we speak of that. If there's anything that we can do as your conference, please reach out to us and let us know. And thank you for spending your afternoon with us. And God bless you.